So when I do train ITIL V3 foundation courses, I do try to make it interesting, but I will cover a little bit of the drier side of it to start, just to make sure that everybody has a frame of reference and understands what we're talking about. So obviously, if you've joined this call, you at least have some interest in ITIL, or the IT, Information Technology Infrastructure Library. The goal really here with the ITIL framework is to increase value that IT brings to the organization. So you would want to grow in maturity from just being an engineering support for the IT infrastructure within the organization, really growing to more of a business partner where you're helping the business to make some more strategic decisions and really have a seat at that table. To give you a little bit of the background of this framework, so this was developed in the mid-1980s, so it really goes back a number of years, and it was function-based. And just like everything else, ITIL has matured over the years. With version 2, it became more of a process-based practice. I think, at least for my part, that's when I started hearing more about ITIL, and I became certified under version 1. It was late in version 1, but really got into the practice and got my service manager certification in version 2. It seems strange that it was 6 years ago already that version 3 was released, and it's really been based a lot on both version 1 and version 2. What we are focused now on is a service lifecycle based practice, and we start from service strategy, go through to continual service improvement, and you can see that represented here by this graphic on the right. So strategy is at the middle. We move on to design, transition, and operation, and then it's all surrounded by continual service improvement. I mentioned that there are continual improvements to ITIL over the years. There was an update that was provided in 2011, and I will incorporate some of that discussion in my introduction here today. Some of the basic concepts that we talk about in ITIL, so again, just to give everybody a little bit of a background, in some organizations that are just becoming familiar with ITIL, they may not have some of these concepts yet of process owners and service owners. But as organizations start to adopt some of these processes and practices, it's helpful to, if not designate these as titles for individuals, at least to identify that, for example, whoever is the help desk or service desk manager usually owns or has some ownership over the incident management process, for example, and would be considered the incident management process owner. Likewise, it's helpful to identify service owners. So you might have perhaps called somebody an email administrator. Well, really, they're the email service owner, and it really incorporates that concept of somebody being responsible for the full service life cycle. There is a lot of intersection between process owners and service owners. So I think one of the things that I usually try to impress on others when I'm talking about ITIL is that communication is really key and very important to this whole concept of ITIL. So if I'm the incident manager, for example, it's very important that I interface with the owners of the various services, that I know how to support those services when I'm speaking with the end users. So hopefully a lot of you have your questions ready, but I do want to introduce some of the process concepts to help perhaps some of you who may not have questions ready yet to start thinking about some of the things that you may want to learn more about. So I'm going to go briefly through the 5 service life cycle components, and then we'll open it up for questions. So starting with the first phase of the life cycle, we talk about service strategy. This is logically where we start to develop the strategy and the mission of for a particular service. When we talk about service portfolio management, for example, we're talking about introducing a service into the pipeline, so the business identifies, or IT perhaps identifies, that a new service is required, and this is really where the whole process starts. In service strategy, we also talk about the concepts of financial management, and it is important for IT to understand financial management. We certainly understand budgets for the most part, and accounting, being able to report how we're doing against those budgets, but costing sometimes is difficult. IT really is encouraged to get to the point where they can identify costs associated with individual services for the individual end users within the organization. Demand management is also a process that we introduce in service strategy. How do we manage the demand? How do we provide costing or other types of points on the services that we provide so that we can appropriately provide demand according to the demand? And it may be not for the whole organization, but it may be by department. The two processes that are highlighted in green at the bottom of this slide were introduced with version 2011, Strategy Management and Business Relationship Management. Business relationship management is interesting in particular because it contrasts with what we're more familiar with in terms of service level management. So in IT, we deal with how do we manage the service levels that we provide to our customers. A business relationship manager, however, is not as focused on contracts, but is instead focused on being side by side with the customer all the way at the beginning when you're talking about strategy and kind of managing projects and managing that relationship with the customer. Once we've developed our strategy, we put together what we call a service requirements package. That requirements package is then handed off to the next phase, service design. Here we want to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the business by designing services for them. And there are a number of processes that are introduced in the service design phase. And I say introduced because when we talk about the processes in the relationship to the various phases, they're not really restricted to only being active in that particular phase. There are considerations for these processes throughout the service lifecycle. But in service design, we introduce kind of the four together: availability, capacity, continuity, and security management. Those are all important considerations for the design of our service. We also need to start thinking already about service level management. So when we provide this service, what are the service targets that we are going to commit to be able to meet? Also, a hot topic lately is service catalog management. How do we actually define in enough detail the services that we are providing in the production environment? Supplier management is important because it really helps us to get the value that we need out of the suppliers or vendors that we're dealing with. And then finally, again, something else that's new with version 2011 is design coordination. How do we make all of this work together? From service design, we develop a service design package, which in turn is handed off to service transition. The word transition logically makes us think of change management, and that is the central process to this particular phase. Change management is very closely tied to configuration management because change management does depend on an accurate configuration model in order to be able to make good change management decisions. And change management also will often hand off the implementation of a change to release and deployment management. It's also not too early to start thinking about knowledge management. So as we are especially doing testing and training that are part of release and deployment management, that's where we can really start to capture some good information to incorporate into our knowledge base for knowledge management. Some of the activities in service transition include planning and support, validation and testing, as I mentioned, and also new with version 2011, change evaluation or review. At the conclusion of the service transition phase of the life cycle, we develop, or we have what we call a service release package. So our release package then gets deployed into the live or operational environment. For a lot of the customers that we work with, this is really where the business sees the value of IT, especially in incident management. That's usually when we're asked, sometimes the question comes up, if I'm going to implement ITIL, what process do I start with? And the logical first step is incident management, because it's really something that's not optional for organizations. IT has to provide break-fix support, and that's what incident management essentially is. Incident management is very closely tied with all of the other processes listed here, being able to manage the events or capture alerts that come into the organization. Problem management, which is a little bit different from incident management in that problems look at more underlying root cause analysis as opposed to just simple break fix. Request management is when somebody is asking for a new service as opposed to reporting a service that is broken. And finally, access management, very closely tied to identity management, or sometimes also referred to as identity management. In service operation, we also introduced the 4 functions within the ITIL framework. You should all be familiar with service desk, also referred to as help desk, technical and application management, and IT operations management. Finally, from service operation, the output that we have here are reports. Most of us are familiar with having to produce reports. Reports get handed off to the phase of continual service improvement. This is a concept that we need to continually evaluate how we are doing and take corrective action as necessary.